Bingo. All right. So, did we get to this? We got the summer 29.
That's the stock market, debt going up. Oh,
We got this? All right, good. Speaking of trickle-down economics, who was the Secretary of Treasury for all three Republican presidents? Andrew Miller. And the whole goal is for government to put money in whose hands?
The rich.
Yeah, so they make the rules or set things up that money will funnel to the very wealthy. With the idea is, what would they do with that money?
Invested.
Create jobs, build factories. They will need employment, so they'll create supply, employment, and that supply will create what? Demand, and that's the key thing, demand. So the whole idea is we build it if they have more money. But did they build factories? They did some, there was a little bit of a boom, but a lot of that money went to what? Yes, speculation. Stocks, and where was the real estate boom? What state? Florida. Florida. And so the real estate boom, and what was the feeling towards regulation, if you believe in trickle-down economics? Yeah. No regulation. What was that idea that I gave you for, I told you the name for things that will help cushion the blow in a bad economy, like Social Security, aid for education, unemployment insurance, yes, a safety net. Safety net? Yes, no. No. So the more conservative, the less you believe in that. And it's very social Darwinistic. What day is it today? It is Flamingo Friday. Are you willing? I had to change the battery, so it's going to be glowing. It's going to be stunning. Drum roll, please. Some of you won't do it, but it's yes. You're still here. That's really cool. All right. So, Hoover's elected president. Now, the thing is, the Depression had already begun. By September of 1929, profits were dropping really fast. But remember the boom bust cycle. You have overproduction, leads to the crap, leads to cutbacks, and people try to make up the difference in the stock market. Profits were dropping by September. It was clear that the country was entering a recession. So a recession is 1 or 2 months of rising unemployment and a shrinking economy. There's no set definition. But people tried to make up the difference in the stock market. And remember, a lot of them lost money in the Florida real estate boom, especially banks. So back one right here, the peak was September 3rd in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. You probably heard of the Dow. You might have heard that term before. Well, what the Dow Jones Industrial Average is, it's a very crude measure of the size of the stock market. It's they take the top 30 stocks, the top 30 companies, and it will change. And they have a ratio of the stock values, company values, and the number of shares sold, come up with a ratio, and that's Dow Jones. You can look it up. It's online. I'm not gonna make a big deal about the ratio. And don't forget, this is at a time where everything had to be done by hand. There weren't as many stocks. It couldn't be as fast as sales. So it was, about 379. Anybody know what it is today? It's about 41,000 something. It's just more sales. Actually, I look. I'll find the computer. It's 41,845. We are in the middle of what kind of market? Bear or bull? Bear. It's very much a bear. It dropped. The Dow Jones dropped about 400 points earlier today, and now it's down 108. People are terrified right now. It's fun to be scared. Moving on. So, but October 24th, there would be a horrific crash. There have been a couple little bubbles down, but they call Black Thursday. There's going to be 3 black days in this. Black as in doom. This idea that the power is going to go out soon. This whole thing about it. And stocks dropped dramatically. So they dropped from about 305 to 281, a big drop on the Dow Jones. And they had what's called a bank holiday the next Friday. They shut down the stock market. Now, today, if there's a really big drop, they have certain breaking points, and it automatically shuts off trade. So they keep it from tanking too far. The last time that happened was 2020. So if it just goes in free fall, stock values, they stop. Because so much of speculation is emotion. Remember the boom bust cycle when the boom's going on and something, or you're all going to get rich? It's emotional. We're spend. And then when prices go down, we're all going to die, doom. And so that's the stop it. It really is a big casino in many ways. And so Black Friday, and then officials from the US government went on, state government too, because remember, this is in New York City. They went out and gave these reassurances. Andrew Mellon went on the radio, NBC radio, they had NBC A and NBC B at that time. A was East Coast, B was West Coast, nationwide. And he said, don't worry, the stock market is strong. The stock market is secure. Don't sell, buy, it will come back up. This is just a momentary correction, he called it. That should be familiar, that's what they're calling it today. Correction. But anybody know what he had already secretly told his brokers? Sell everything. So what did he just do to the American public? Lied to his teeth. Now you could argue, and he would say later, I was just doing it for the health of the entire stock market in the country. But he also was telling people, don't sell until I sell first. Because when everyone sells, prices will tank. Monday, hey, let's have Black Monday. It didn't work. That night, it's hair on fire pan. Head of the Federal Reserve met with the president, the secretary of the Treasury. There was meetings with members of Congress. I mean, this was like a real, should we shut the stock market down? What do we do? The Federal Reserve was slow in reacting. All kinds of problems going on. Oh, he was leaving a little bit early. And I literally just saw him too, and I thought, man, you can't function without him. The next morning, Tuesday morning, stocks started going up. And people, there was almost like this cheer when back then they would put stock values, they had these massive boards, they write them in with chalk. That guy's up and down the ladders putting chalk. Today it's a big electronic board, obviously. And stock prices began to go up. And people were reassured. They thought, okay, we have made it. We're okay. And then all of a sudden it began to tank. You know what's coming? The worst day of them all. Black Tuesday. So this would be the worst drop in the stock market ever. And it's absolutely amazing how bad it was. Remember, everything had to be done by hand. Now, how did you find stock values? How did you hear about this? Stock values in 1929 if you weren't actually in the exchange? Well, they had people typing it in on telegraph lines, and they would send it out really quick. If you ever look at stock values today and notice that it's usually 3-letter abbreviations for all the stock, for all the companies. There's so many companies now, because they're just bigger. Sometimes there's 4, but there's 3. That's so they can type it in really fast and then put the value. And they type it in on telegraph line, alphabetically, so that people typing the whole time, A to Z of all the names of the different companies. And they would send it out on the telegraph line. And these little machines called ticker tape machines would print it out in a very thin little piece of paper. Here is the stock exchange on that day. These are saved ticker tape. And these are PBX, these are company. And that's stock value. And so you'd be brokerages all around the country would be hooked up to this. And these ticker tape machines would just run all the time, just slowly, just kind of running out. A to Z, A to Z. So you would look through and you wait for the stock you care about with the price. Right? That's how they did it. Well, you can imagine what's happening that morning. Then prices started to drop. People started to, oh my God, panic. And the brokers were like seeing this, going, oh my God. And they got on the phone to their brokers on the floor of the stock exchange and said, sell. And that turned into sell more to everybody selling. And all of a sudden, when everyone starts selling the stock, even healthy companies, because this is kind of emotional, the prices tumble. And so they're selling shares like mad. And now all of a sudden, they're typing crazy fast because prices are dropping so fast. And so they're coming through and all, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then the telegraph lines are overloaded and froze for 2 hours, no communication. Could you imagine sitting there in a brokerage and think, oh, my life might be over. A margin call is coming up and I owe millions. Oh no, and then no information. That's what we call hair on fire panic. We're gonna die. And yet people freaked out. By the end of the day, now think about this. This had to be done all on paper. 60 million shares were sold. All on paper. You know, today it can be done much faster. That's why they started this automatic break after the crash in 87. 60 million shares, absolute panic. This was a day that shocked everybody. They can have bigger drops today simply because they can do it faster with computers. This is remarkable. There were 15,000 miles of ticker tape. You don't need to know that. That's just one of those little bits of trivia I didn't want to forget. Because they're coming out so fast. And that's 2 hours being down. It's amazing. Anybody know what they do with all that ticker tape? And just in October alone, with the 3 big crashes and a mediocre month, $16 billion in paper value loss. Paper value means this. It's not that you have the actual money, but you have stock that a piece of paper saying a stock or a security, a bond that you think is worth this much money and it goes down to here. You thought you had that much money and it drops. That's paper value. So like today, since the stock market is dropping, people are losing paper value. If you have money in the stock market, you've lost paper value. You went from having this much wealth to a little bit lower. You thought you had a horrific month that would only get worse. And the economy was already bad. But now we have a financial disaster. And within a couple months, it would be worldwide. No one had ever seen anything like this. And this is going to lead to the near end of the US government in the United States. And it will lead to the growth of this obscure little party in Germany that nobody liked called the National Socialists. This will cause change everywhere and almost lead to the collapse of other governments in Europe and lead to the generals just taking over in this other place you might have heard of called Japan. Things are happening fast. So that's outside the stock market. And these are people lined up, just kind of in disarray outside. You might look, some of them are holding pieces of paper. These are stocks they thought was. Now, what has just happened? And after 3 days, that's part of the reason it was so bad. 1 day is horrible. 3. But what do they do with the ticker tape? Well, they save it. And they use it for parades. And they're called ticker tape parades. Now, 5th Avenue, New York, where you have all the skyscrapers. And if you ever go to 5th Avenue, sometimes it's called the Avenue of the Americas in some areas. And you drop those in big bags from the roof of the skyscrapers. Here they come. Well, look at it. It's pretty cool. Spiraling down. Anybody know what that is? Having a parade for her? 35, Amelia Earhart. She had just flown across the Atlantic alone, so the first woman to do that. But in 2 years, she would mysteriously disappear in the Pacific on an attempted worldwide flight. Still don't know exactly. And I'm kept with the aviation theme. Here's one from 1961. It's right there. It's kind of hard to see, but that's John Glenn. John Glenn. First American. Yeah, first American over there. Yeah, John Glenn. In fact, he became such a big hero after that, they wouldn't let him go into space. It's so bad. Yeah. I could go. He'd go into the Senate, serve in the Senate until 1992. He's a Democrat from Ohio. And then in 1993, he went up on the space shuttle, so he had to go up one more time. Pretty cool. I like it. So here's a good cartoon of this euphoria. Stock boom, buying order. I'm not for the boom. I want to buy stocks. Never will go down. This is from 29. Stock slump. Everything has gone to smash. I love that. Gone to smash. That means bad. I'm going to sell whatever I can get. Sell for whatever I can get. And that would lead to an unprecedented crash. Here's the New York Times. This is one of the most famous headlines from Variety, kind of the Hollywood trade magazine. Wall Street lays an egg. This is in a lot of stuff. But this is the New York Times stock index. They don't use it anymore, but they use it then. It's probably more accurate. The most accurate stock index today to give you an idea of the stock market is the S&P, Standard & Poor's 500. I know what's going on in the stock market. Dow Jones is not very good. Only 30 points. The height, it never got back to that height again in the 1960s. These are the biggest stock market crashes in history so far. And that's Monday and Tuesday. Right here. The biggest, 1987. That's when they put that little breaker, but now they can trade so much more because of computers. Hey, you are alive for the second biggest. Don't you feel cool? No, I was alive for all of them. I can still vividly remember that 1899. That was nasty. That was nasty. I remember I was in junior American history. So Mr. Leckie said, we just finished the Spanish-American War before this happened. Okay, moving on. The Great Depression. Okay, Mr. Leckie actually was. I wasn't in history in 1899. I know it's easy to believe. So, what about the Great Depression? It started right here. And by the end of 29, stocks had lost $25 billion. So people thought they had fortunes and they were using that for collateral for debts. And now they don't have collateral and they got to make up the difference. They don't have the money. People were leveraged to the hills. Production went down by a third, auto sales down by a third. And think about that. If you don't buy cars, that's going to ripple to every part of the economy. But by 32, here is the chart of the GDP, the gross domestic product. A very crude measure, but it gives you an idea of all the value of all goods and services. This is indexed towards 2000 money. We don't care where it's indexed to. We just want to see the graph. Here's 29. Look at where it's by 32. You will notice one thing too. Look at the big growth back. But know why? The New Deal. The New Deal rolls it up. But at 32, the gross domestic product had shrunk by a third. This was a massive contraction. The money supply was down by a third. There was a third less money in circulation. There was money, but people weren't spending. Especially those with wealth, they just sat on it. And 9,000 banks had shut their doors. Unemployment was at 25%, but unemployment is a very crude measurement. To this day, it doesn't count people who aren't looking for work anymore, and thousands have given up. And it doesn't count farmers who they're practically self-employed at this time. They're already below the poverty line. So here's the unemployment rate. So it was worse than that. But you can imagine what's going to happen. You got people giving up. You got people that are going to be unhoused and hitting the road. Migrants trying to find work. 32 was a scary year. Just about lost the country. Just about lost it. It was close. So, what were the causes of this? And by the way, here's another sign. Remember I mentioned the internal migrants? You could also imagine cities who have their own problems. They did not want migrants coming in because it already strains the services they already have. Yeah, because of the incredibly high housing costs, we have a significantly high population of unhoused people today. And the same thing about cities today. So first thing is we know is overproduction. That is always the biggest issue. And I put this picture on the right. Prices dropping because that's for farmers. the farm economy was already tanked. But then the big three that would also tank by then would be automobiles, construction, and then all consumer electronics, all these new things, everything from a mixmaster to a refrigerator to a washing machine. But the biggest one, consumer electronics, would be radio. And they tanked, sales tanks. But nothing was more important than cars. Your car sitting on a lot unsold. Because think about cars. Okay, car sales go down. We can all immediately say, okay, that means car dealerships are going to lose money, maybe go out of business. The automakers will lose money and a lot will go out of business. But it's more than this, that. Think about what you need to make a car. What do you need to make a car? Car stuff, right? What do you need? Steel. What's going to happen to steel production if people aren't buying cars? It will tank. So that means you'll ripple to there. What else do you need? Yeah, oil production will drop dramatically. Akron, Ohio is going to have 50% unemployment. Anybody know what they make in Akron to this day? Tires. Rubber production will tank. Akron, gone. Leather. That's what they made the seats out of. Glass for the windows. Copper for the wiring for the car. All that production gone. Everything will tank. And cars were such a bigger part of the economy then. You don't sell cars, all those things. You don't sell cars, there's rioting in the streets in Detroit. There's rioting in the streets in Akron. There's rioting in the streets. Yes, all that would happen by 1932. And what else do you need? You have a car. What else do you need? Hey, are you going to build any more roads? All the money from the roads, from road production was just starting to heat up. The government was for roads. They pay for business, but pay for roads. Late 1920s, no more roads. What else do you need? Hey, you're driving your car down a road. What do you need? Huh? Gas stations, gone. What else? What happens if you're driving down the road and you get tired and need to stop? What do you need? Huh? Well, restaurants weren't around yet, but like gas stations, stores, restaurants. What up? Okay. Yeah, hotel. Well, not any hotel. It's a hotel for motorists. A motor hotel, motel. So, yeah, that's for motel. Yeah.
Only hotels.
I remember the same time we were like, no way. Well, now it makes sense. But all those businesses go out, auto shops go down. It'll rip from every part of the economy. And think about this. If you're in Akron, Ohio, and let's say you start a little restaurant. How are you doing? You're gone. No one's buying your stuff. So stores and restaurants go out of business. It ripples to every part of the economy. So with construction and radio, we can see too, but the big thing was cars. So let's review very quickly. Prices and profits go down. I love this one. Farm industry prices go down because of overproduction, but it happens everywhere. Happened in construction too. We saw it in 2006, 2007 with construction here. Construction in America, building houses as fast as possible, then it tanked. We've never made up the deal. Part of the reason there's a housing shortage today is we haven't made up for the crash in housing back in 2007. And no one has addressed that. Now it's a crisis. Go buy a home in Bozeman, you see what the crisis looks like. So everyone produced more and more debt. That leads to cutbacks. Produce more, trying to get out of debt. Everyone's trying to get out of debt. We get cutbacks. What happens with cutbacks? We get unemployment. And demand stinks. Sales drop. So this is why they call it the deflationary curve. This is what was going on that summer. And so the problem was the economy was already weak, and then bang, the crash comes. So overproduction. Now, we can see this today in things, if car sales tank, that really hurts the economy, but not like it hurt it back in 1929. Because the consumer economy was so new, it was only just a few products. Same thing, people quit buying radios, it could really hurt. Today, yes, the economy is more diversified, so if sales drop in one thing, it won't kill the economy. But you can imagine it rippling to a number of different things. And that's why we had that recession and that's something. So that's overproduction. And people already didn't have a lot of money, so they don't have a lot of cushion. So they start losing their jobs. It's not like they could dip into savings. Most people didn't have savings. Speaking of savings, yeah, I wonder where that's going to go. I like this one, the short history of depression. Put up a little cartoon of everything's great. Look at the limo, the Rolls Royce. 32, the bicycle. So speculation. So tax cuts were supposed to go to increase production, but they were not going to increase production. It was cycling amongst the very wealthy. Every time this happened. Remember I showed you that chart, it had 87, the biggest crash ever? Why? Because there was one of the largest tax cuts in history geared towards the very wealthy took place in 1986, and there was a crash in 87. There was massive tax cuts for the very wealthy in 2001 and 2003, and there was a crash in 2008. We'll see. There's proposals for $7.5 trillion in tax cuts. Right now, almost all of them to the very wealthy. And so that's part of the reason why they're desperately trying to cut everything, even though it's only pennies, because they could act like they're trying to save. So back to this. And top 1% own 90% of the stock. Now they only own it. The top 1% own about 65%. Why? Because beginning in the 1980s, there was something called individual retirement accounts, IRAs. You might have heard that term before. But IRAs became a way for people, middle class people, to save money for retirement. Where does that money normally go? It's invested in stock. So my wife and I have stock. You know, I guess a lot of your parents or grandparents might have some stock, but probably not as much as some people. So there are going to be two massive bubbles, and people are going to be leveraged to the hilt. You know what leverage means? Leverage means this: you're in debt, and what did you put up for collateral? All your assets. But remember, if times are good, what the heck? We'll get money tomorrow. I'm going to leverage everything and buy. So you leverage all your stock, your assets, your homes, and people are leveraged beyond belief. Now I should add, businesses are leveraged already. They're always leveraged. The richest people in the world are leveraged to the hilt. They just have wealth with the expectation it won't go down. So the crash exposed all the debt. So they had this massive speculation when prices were overvalued, the debt was exposed. And that's actually the term they use, exposing of the debt. So I like this one, the nationwide fever of stock speculation. They knew it was happening. There was talk. In fact, one of President Hoover's first meetings was about that. So the gap between the rich and poor. We already talked about the inequalities yesterday. And don't forget, the goal of trickle-down economics was wealth to flow to the top. And so for most people, their wages was dropping. So we already talked about that in class. And once again, monopolies focus wealth. Finance focus wealth. But here is the share of wealth of the top 0.1%, nearly 25% of the wealth, 1920. 2013 is about the same level. And the majority of the population made less than $2,000 a year. And I put this graph out there because I couldn't find a good one on the poverty. Remember, most people below the poverty. And so most people didn't have extra money. And here's the deal. If you have a consumer economy where it requires people to buy those 5 million cars built every year, I'm sorry, and people don't have money, eventually they'll get to the point if their wages are dropping or staying stagnant, where they can't afford the debt anymore. They can't afford to buy something. And the important thing to understand is this: a large gap between the rich and the poor is an economic ticking time bomb for an economy. It's an economic ticking time bomb for a capitalistic economy that requires consumer debt. So we're kind of in late capitalism now because it kills demand. Eventually, people won't be able to afford to buy something. And all it takes is a few to start it, and it begins to ripple. A few people can afford, sales begin to drop, they begin to produce more, and the cycle begins. The gap between the rich and poor. And that's why I showed you that chart that said 10% of people today make 50% of all sales. Eventually, people won't be able to afford to buy stuff. And debt will go up, and then eventually they can't afford any more. Borrow money to buy their home, and eventually they can't afford it. So we're jumping right to this, financial failure, number 4. So this was a real problem with the banks. There was no regulation of banks at all. Well, I mean, that's not quite true. Every state had a regulation, but that means you have 48 different regulations at that time. And it was bounced all over the place, and they weren't very strictly enforced. So banks were making really risky loans, especially after the crash of 27 in Florida real estate. And they were keeping no reserves. Now, every state required some kind of reserve. You have to have a little bit of money on hand. Remember, we talked about this. Banks take in, say, people put deposits, and then they immediately loan them out. And every state had a rule of at least you must have a few reserves of your deposits to pay back people who want want money out of their savings account. When the expectation is they're not going to all come at once. Most states have between 5 and 10%. Can I ask you something? They didn't have reserves, meaning, what's a reserve? The idea was 10% of your deposits in cash. Safe. At this time. It's not like that today. What is an asset? Let me ask you something. So, say Andy borrowed money from me. The bank, signed a piece of paper saying, you have $1,000 in my bank. I just gave an IOU. Didn't I give you an IOU? I didn't. That's an IOU. I owe you. Does that make sense? That's a debt. Well, let's say somebody else borrowed. They give me an IOU. That's an asset. That's money they owe me. That's a piece of paper that they owe me money. So I put that IOU. That's what they're doing. 10% down. You see a problem with that. If everyone's paying back their debt, that's fine, isn't it? But let's say people don't pay it back. My asset's worthless, isn't it? Now, what can I do with that asset? I might have this piece of paper for an asset. I can't do that because it is a legal contract. You know what I can do? I can sell it, can't I? Could I sell that? Could I sell it? It's an asset. Do banks do that? All the time. So you buy a house and get a mortgage, and so go to a local commercial bank and get a mortgage. They give you the loan. They immediately sell it to another bank. Immediately. I mean, it's gone. They don't keep it. They sell it right away. So I got this. You know what else I can do? I can chop it up into little bits and combine it with other people's debts and sell new little things. They're called securities or bonds. They're called asset-backed securities. And I can sell those. You think that happened? All the time. Asset-backed securities. And then I could actually do that, buy other asset-backed securities from somebody else, chop those up and sell them again. And then they could take that and chop it up and sell it again. And they could take it out and sell it again. And I could buy those back and chop it up and sell it again. Does that sound confusing? I'll chop and sell. In 2008, the asset-backed security market in the United States was over $50 trillion. And nobody knew what anybody had, which is chaos. So you could have a situation where you could have bank A. Oh, let's get, I want to go to one more step. So it was all built on debt, interlocking debt. You could have bank A, and it wanted to borrow money. It wanted to loan money out. So it would sell all its debt and borrow money from bank B. It would borrow money from bank C. They'd all be borrowing. Who borrow money from bank D, who might borrow from the very first bank A. You might have this whole cycle where all the banks are borrowing from somebody. You see the problem with that? All it takes is one of those banks to collapse, and the whole thing falls like a house of cards. Is that what happened in 1929? Yes. Is that what happened in 2008? Yes. Could that happen today? The problem today is we only have a few banks that control almost all the banking. So if one of those banks collapse, So you have a bank panic. Here's a bank panic lined up at the door in 1929. Then you have bank failures. Banks cannot make it. And by the way, so you have a bank failure. What happens to your savings if the bank fails? Gone. And here's the big look at all the bank failures in 1932-33. I should add, why did they end? There were a few bank failures and then no more.
Because there weren't any more banks left to fail.
Not quite. We're on the right track. And then Roosevelt's New Deal. The New Deal set up regulations so that wouldn't happen. Save the world's economy today. Here is the amount of credit, bang, collapsing. But then we have a credit freeze and nobody, would you loan money anymore? If you survive, banks don't loan. And that would happen in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012. Don't you remember those days when you were 2 or 3 years old and you tried to borrow money? You couldn't do it, could you? That happened in our country here. It happened that a credit freeze. If there's no credit, there can be no business function. Business is a function, thus making the depression worse. A financial failure. So debt deflation is even more confusing. Debt deflation is really heavy economics here. This is one of the big issues that came out of this depression, and it's one of the least understood. So I'll explain it as best I can. So you have a depressed economy. Think about it, depressed economy. You're worried either you got unemployed, your money's not coming in, or you're worried it might happen to you. And what we have is what's called everybody's favorite term, a liquidity trap. Nobody has money to pay back their debt. Have you ever heard the term like liquid assets before? What that means is cash on hand. You have money to spend. You don't have to sell stuff to get money. You don't have to borrow money. You have money sitting there. But no one has money because no one is spending money. This is called the M2, the monetary, this is the M2 table of money in circulation. And it tanked during the Depression. So no one had, there was money, the money that was in circulation was being hoarded. Most people had no money, so they couldn't pay back the debt. It's called a liquidity trap. We had a liquidity trap in 2008, 2009. Well, what's going to happen with a liquidity trap? Well, everyone's going to cut spending together because they got to figure out a way to make money. If there's no money in circulation, I just can't spend this money. I mean, think about it for a second. You got to pay back your debt. And it's a responsible thing to do if you're an individual. Let's say things are going good and you go out and buy a boat. I'm going to buy a boat because I need a yacht to sail around Spring Meadow Lake. And you borrow money for this yacht. And by the way, there's a bunch of yachts out there, right? We're all yachting around Spring Meadow Lake. Need a shallow draft. But all of a sudden now, things aren't looking good and you're having trouble paying back your debt. So what do? Don't you cut back money to save? That's a responsible thing to do as an individual. Same thing as a business. You overextended, you cut back to pay back your debts. Sound responsible, doesn't it? But think about it if everybody in the country does it at the same time. And then you sell off your additional assets to pay off the debt. So, I don't need 2 yachts at Spring Meadow Lake, right? Who's with it?
Only really
60-foot yachts are just, there's 2. I don't need 2. I sell 1. But what's everybody else doing with their yachts? And what happens to the price of yachts? Or vacation homes, or stock, or gold, or any other assets? Tons. The joke was everything was for sale. We might be witnessing this very soon. Everything for sale. Everything for sale and prices drop. And if everybody tries to pay off their debt at the same time, that's death. Everyone does it at the same time. As an individual, it might seem responsible. If everyone does it at the same time, asset prices tumble. If asset prices tumble, can you pay back your debt? So what do you got to do? Well, the depressed economy continues. Like the arrow, and the cycle starts again. The cycle starts again. So you cut back spending. By the way, what's happening to demand? Demand for goods are dropping like a bomb. No one's buying anything. And then you sell again. Oh God, Henry. You can have a situation where everybody tries to pay back their debt at the same time, and debt actually goes. Because they can't pay back their debt and asset prices drop. So you got to sell more. and the economy gets worse and people aren't buying stuff. So here are two graphs. I showed you this one. This is price of goods. This is the Great Depression. And so people didn't want to spend. So I told you about my great grandpa who had the store. It was attacked because his German name. Well, he didn't trust banks. And would you trust banks at this time? No. And he put his money into pickles, selling big, massive jars of pickles. He'd sell individual pickles at the market. He started putting coins in them. Silver coins. Now, these still had silver in them. If you find a silver coin, so nickel up, before 1964, it has silver in it. There's a little bit of silver in it. Not a lot, but there's silver. But anyways, he put the coin there and he buried it behind the store. Buried it. No idea where. He had a heart attack and died quite suddenly. I know my grandpa and uncles and my uncle, they tried to find him. They found a couple jars, but there's probably 30 back there. They found like 2. But he didn't trust banks.
Outcome the whole thing.
So he then buried, well, they eventually lost it, had to sell it. So when my grandma passed away, his daughter, my mom and I were driving around Hillville, Nebraska, kind of seeing spots. She remembered the town had grown so much. We went to the side of the old store. It's no longer there. It's a parking lot. For what? A bank. Yeah, I know. I can't make that up. It's true. I remember when I was really young, the store was like this ramshackle thing, but it had been torn down since. So I did see it when I was really. So back to this. At the same time, government has all this tool and they fail. Partially out of ignorance, partially out of trickle-down ideology, partially out of just not just ignorance, just stupidity. So there was no regulation on banks or stocks. There was no regulation. This led to every time there's no regulation, there's going to be profit. Next, no safety net. There was no unemployment insurance. So when unemployment began to go up, there was nothing to cushion the blow. It was a disaster. There was a lot of talk, and here's like him saying, detour to business, no speculation, but that's not going to do anything. The Federal Reserve did the opposite of what they should do. Now, this was partially out of ignorance, but the Federal Reserve should raise interest rates to stop the bubble. They didn't raise it until it was too late. And then when things are bad, they should cut it. They didn't cut it fast enough. They didn't lower rates fast enough. And that's why on Tuesday, when the Federal Reserve Board met and talking about, they got a problem. Inflation is a lot lower. They're worried about inflation. So they don't, but it's not as low as they wanted. So they don't want to raise interest rates. But they also said the economy is going to get worse. So we should lower it, but we don't want to lower it too fast. They're in this weird area right now. And then, of course, one of the most famous events in history. The thought was we must promote the business. Remember, tariffs are protection. Protectionist tariffs. So there was a vote in Congress signed by President Hoover to double the size of the tariff. With the idea is to protect American industry so they can start selling. So this would become in history known as the Hawley-Stokes tariff. Now, what do tariffs do to all prices? They raise them at a time that nobody has money. And then what do our trading partners do to their tariffs? That started a trade war. At a time we need to be selling everything, the United States raised tariffs. Now, I have no reference today about tariffs. It's just beyond my pay grade. But just imagine that happened today. What could happen? There is a big difference. So the tariffs that President Trump has imposed, because the law gives the president the power to do that, what a law that is. But and the tariff things were imposed for like 3 hours, then took off. The economy when he came in was the envy of the world, the U.S. economy. Exactly. And so the economy was good. Big problems of inequality, but good. Here they did it in the middle of a depression. That's a big difference. But it still has the same kind of effect. This is going to become infamous And there are a few people talking about the tariffs that are going on right now and saying, don't you remember the Holly Smoot tariffs? The problem is most Americans had no idea what the Holly Smoot tariff actually was. So the last thing, we'll get austerity and we'll finish this on Monday. Did you guys get a witness what tariffs do? And I'm not actually negative towards all tariffs. I'm not positive towards tariffs. I think it's complex. But we will see.